Hello, everybody. Welcome to Healing the Grieving Heart of America with Sarah Peterson and me, Terri Daniel. Sarah is a social worker with a hospice focus. She's been with many dying and grieving people in her career. I am a pastoral counselor with more of a spiritual focus, and we both work with trauma and grief and loss. And today we're going to talk about all different kinds of losses that we're all experiencing in America right now. We'll go into detail specifically about those different types of losses, but everybody in our country, perhaps in our world, is grieving because we've lost so much, not just because of COVID-19, but because of so many changes going on politically and socially and economically. So that is the general gist of our topic today. And, you know, some of you are here because you've lost a loved one, perhaps a pet, a job. It's all here in the container, and we hope that we can give you some really good tools to work with it. I myself had a child die 14 years ago. It was just his birthday the other day. And Sarah lost her daughter 3 years ago. So we're coming from the grieving parent's perspective. So, and I know there are many grieving parents here. So let's start with Sarah. Talk to us about the different types of losses that we can experience.
Sure. And I would like to just start by going a little further with what Terri started by saying, you know, we are all here for a different type of loss, and whether that's what you call a big loss or a life loss or something we're all experiencing together because of COVID or social justice issues, there's a time and a place for loss is loss. And that's the time and place that we're trying to cultivate right now. There's also a time and place where your loss can really only be tended to through, say, a similar loss with somebody else. I remember, you know, in the early months after losing my daughter, trying to join a grief group where there was pet loss and grandparent loss. And it was just very important for me at that time to be with people who'd lost a child, because that type of grief is so extreme and different. And now today, this experience, acknowledging that loss is not always loss. For the purpose of this conversation, when we talk about grief and loss, we really are trying to put an umbrella over a shift, an unwanted change, a point of contention, a stuck point. So I just want to be really clear that it's not to diminish deep loss over a child or something and bunching everybody together, because I realize that each grief experience is different. But like I said, for the purpose of this conversation, we'll just try to put everything under the one umbrella. There are many types of losses, like I've just sort of mentioned. One of them is material loss, and that's losing your home, losing something that was meaningful to you, financial, a car, you know, any type of radical shift like that is a loss, a material loss. There's relationship loss, death causes that, divorce, estrangement, dealing with an estrangement when the person is still alive is very complicated and most certainly a profound part of grief. There's also the intrapsychic loss, loss of identity, loss of self, your belief system, your assumption. We see a lot of that with maybe what we're experiencing social justice-wise, institutions that were there to protect, we see breaking down and not doing what we expected them to do. Functional loss, loss from physical limitation caused by illness or injury. Role loss, you know, empty nesters, having kids go off to college, leaving the house to the parents alone, losing a spouse, losing your job title, all these things that, you know, when you think of introducing yourself to somebody, you know, what are the first few things that come to mind as you describe yourself? Those are your identity. And what if those shift, change, or go away? System loss, again, you know, what you thought your church would do for you, your government would do for you, and realizing that they're not meeting those expectations. That's a loss. And, you know, our government today, perhaps you're feeling loss over protection around COVID. Maybe it's not going the way you think it should be. To honor that loss as a type of grief. And then there's anticipated loss versus unanticipated. And an anticipated loss might be, you know, grandma's 92, she's lived a great life, she's on hospice, we're prepared, ducks are in a row, final goodbyes are said. It's a very meaningful time, yet an anticipated loss. Versus an unanticipated loss, which I define as almost a traumatic loss, untimely, unexpected, and sudden. My daughter, she died when my car was hit by a drunk driver at 9 a.m. on a Sunday morning. She died instantly. And that was probably the top of the scale as far as unexpected losses, unanticipated, and traumatic. So, you know, like I started out the conversation by saying we can all put ourselves under this umbrella. So there's just one section of the different types of losses that, as part of the human condition, we are experiencing and are a part of together. So Terri, I'll leave it to you to go over the next section. I can't hear you, Terri. You're on mute.
Okay, sorry, I had my microphone muted. Thank you, Sarah, that was great. And I just want to add, for anticipated, unanticipated, you know, Sarah and I have very different backgrounds. Her daughter's death just literally came out of the blue. My son was severely disabled and seriously ill for half of his life. So that's an example of an anticipated death, kind of like grandma at 92, and you're prepared for it. No one's ever prepared for that to happen to a 16-year-old, but if it's an illness, then it's an anticipated loss. I also wanted to add about role loss. If we are caregivers and the person that we're taking care of dies, we also lose that role of caregivers. Many of us just don't know what to do with ourselves when we've been taking care of somebody for a long time. So I want to add to Sarah's list some other kinds of losses, and all of these losses we're going to talk about today. Sympathetic loss, which is identifying with another person's loss. So when you see something on Facebook or on YouTube and it's a really sad story about a death or any kind of trauma, I don't know about you, but I cry, I feel it. And so I'm experiencing that loss too in a separate kind of way. There's also collective loss, which is loss experienced as a whole community. So think about things like school shootings, earthquakes, natural disasters, fires, where an entire community is having a shared loss. There's tribal national loss, which is social, national, or ethnic groups that have been displaced or marginalized, such as any group that's been colonized, Native Americans, Native Hawaiians, Black people kidnapped into slavery from Africa, losing culture, loss of language, loss of identity, and being a victim of a crime against humanity. So that's a type of loss that many of us also have in our ancestral history. And there's also relinquishment loss, a loss that you choose yourself. If you are quitting a habit, quit smoking, quit drinking, quit eating sugar, you're going to grieve the loss of those things because they were part of your life. So you're grieving relinquishment. And then finally here, loss of autonomy or identity. So if you think about somebody going into the military, you are kind of stripped of your individuality and your identity for group cohesion. But, more extreme, people in prison, what happens to them? What kind of losses are they experiencing, especially now with COVID and everything that's going on in the prisons? If anybody has any other thoughts about losses, type it into the chat room. Anything that we forgot to mention, we'd love to hear your thoughts about it. And you can ask questions and interact with us as much as you want. You don't have to wait until the end. So we like to hear what you have to say. So many of you have probably been in grief groups, maybe in-person grief support groups, maybe online groups, and you may have noticed that you don't always get really good guidance. You don't always get really good advice. So a lot of those groups are not run by professionals with any training in spiritual care or counseling or social work or psychology. And it's very hard to communicate back and forth when the leader of the group doesn't have the language tools to help us express ourselves. So I'm going to turn it over to Sarah, because she's going to talk about nonviolent communication and language that tends to be used around grief that is not helpful for us.
Thanks, Terry. One thing I've noticed both in my practice of working with people who are facing grief of any kind and in my own is this enticing way to compare grief. And how that's shown up for me a lot of times is actually people putting my grief above theirs. Like they'll see me and they'll go, oh, but it's nothing compared to what you've had to deal with, Sarah. Okay, you know, nobody wants to lose a child, that's for sure. It's an unexpected loss. And yet to have that power differential in grief feels so unhelpful, because what it does is it ends up making me want to like care for you and validate that, no, your grief matters too. So if we could just learn a new language around, you know, actually eliminating this notion of competitive grief and understand that it's just really not helpful, because what happened to you is awful for you and what happened to me is awful for me, and they really don't affect each other when you think about it. So when you're with somebody or asking for the help you need, to consider what it means to hear you should be doing this, you should be doing that, you should think this way, feel this way, act this way. And really as a supporter for somebody or in asking for support, to know that this should slip is what I call it, is very unhelpful and really diminishes the type of support you're likely trying to either receive or get. There's a lot to be said for validating instead of wanting to fix the situation. And when you're thinking about grief, the only way to fix it is to bring my child back, bring your job back, make it so COVID no longer exists, return, you know, get social justice figured out so that we don't have to live with inequality. All of these things can't be done in a fix it, snap your finger type of way. So let's stop trying to fix it with shoulds and coulds and woulds, and actually just be present with somebody and validate the angst that they are facing. So acknowledgement of the shared emotion, my gosh, this is heartbreaking. Just think about that. This is heartbreaking. There's no fix it. There's no challenge. There's no competition. This is heartbreaking. And using bridging statements, you know, I miss them too versus I lost them too. Can you hear the difference there? I had somebody say to me once, well, we lost her too. And yes, that's true, but yet they're not her mother. So it's different. And what it would have meant to me for them to say, I miss her too, which is 100% what they were trying to say, but it's when it comes out, it like a competition, there's always going to be a winner and a loser, right? So how can we find the language that brings us together? I miss this too. I miss you going to work too. I miss peaceful times. I miss the way the church once ran. Any one of these things can be done together and collectively. Another tendency we have in our culture is to be very dismissive. And, you know, Dame Cicely Saunders, one of the founding hearts of hospice, said, the pain of the caregiver contributes to the pain of the one being cared for. And what that means is that to the extent that I'm willing to be uncomfortable is the extent that I can be in your discomfort. And when we talk about healing the heart of America right now, we're all pretty uncomfortable. What we're going through as a nation is very uncomfortable. It's heartbreaking, it's difficult. And to the extent that we can recognize our own discomfort is the extent that we can show up for somebody in their discomfort around any number of these issues. So listening, one way we are dismissive is by listening with the intention to respond. You know, somebody's sharing with you, they're being vulnerable, and you can tell if you're the one sharing, the person who's listening with the intent to respond, because you start to speed up so that you can hurry up and finish because you know that they're ready to jump in with their part of the story. Another way that we are very dismissive is by telling people, well, don't feel that way. It'll get better. There's a silver lining. What? How do you know? It might not. There might not be a silver lining. This might just be terrible. And what does that mean to sit with that discomfort? Telling somebody how they should or shouldn't feel or should or shouldn't act is very, very dismissive. So instead, coming up with ways to validate. I understand why it's hard for you to get out of bed today. I understand why it might be hard to look at these old pictures, etc. Connection versus dismissive statements. We can also be very dismissive when we hear something and then jump into what that experience was for us. I like to call it my life story, chapter 43. So somebody's sharing with us their experience. Once again, they're being vulnerable, and yet we're jumping in to tell them how it was for us when that happened. To be present for somebody in their discomfort is to be present for them in their discomfort, not as an entry point for you to share your story, because it's dismissive. It's like you're not listening, you're just waiting for that opportunity to chime in. And again, you know, when we listen or interact or engage with people with the intent to fix or solve the problem, we lose a lot of the material, because oftentimes, almost always, these problems are unfixable. I can't bring back your job. I can't bring back pre-COVID. I can't bring back your child or your parent or your spouse. So what can I do? I can be present. Quit medicating with words. And then, you know, when we talk about bridging statements, it's very important, I think, when you're showing up to any engagement with somebody who is suffering. And, you know, these days, suffering is very divisive. Even when you think about, well, I'm on this side or that side, among those sides are divisions. And so I think it's our real challenge as we shift the culture of grief and how we handle conflict, especially in this time, in this country. You know, show up with your full self, be centered, grounded, complete. And you can demonstrate that through your body language and your eye contact. And then you can really try to identify the collective emotion. Like I said, you know, I am also heartbroken. I miss pre-COVID times too. I understand why it's difficult for you to XYZ. So these are ways to feel connection, to build connection, and offer some validation and witnessing for people. As we talk, I'm going to share my screen here. Some of the buzzwords, because I believe language is really at the essence for this cultural shift. It's really our number one tool to connect with people or be dismissive or disconnect. And so I'm going to share with you my screen here of buzzwords that I would challenge us to use as we discuss points of contention or contemplation or divisive areas. So integrate versus heal. To heal is to completely mend. So is it possible to completely mend from a grief experience? Maybe not. Certainly not over a death or a major life change. So what can we say instead? We can say integrate, learn to live with. Because, you know, in my particular case, if somebody says, oh, you'll heal from the death of your child, well, I don't believe for 1 second that I would heal from losing my daughter. Have I learned to live a meaningful life in her absence? Absolutely. I continue to do that each and every day, but I won't heal. And so if I'm not healing and the whole world is telling me that healing is possible, am I a failure? What does that say about me? And so I challenge us to use the word integrate or learn to live with instead of heal. When you're in the presence of somebody's suffering, their discomfort, or when you yourself are asking for what you need, consider those terms instead of heal. We really toss out the word heal quite a bit. Like I talked about competitive grief, the way in which we compare loss. My grief is or isn't as bad as yours. It's not valuable, and I challenge you to find a time when it would be valuable, because all you're doing is once again diminishing either your experience or the experience of somebody else. It's not a competition. Toxic positivity. So, you know, I kind of think of those life is good shirts. Well, you know, at Clear Morning, we kind of want to make an alternative choice for that, which is, you know, life is kind of brokenhearted sometimes too. And so how can we hold both? There's a Mary Oliver poem, and it's very short, and she says, we shake with joy, we shake with grief. what a time they have, these two housed as they are in the same body. To deny the fact that we also experience emotions other than positivity is a real tragedy, because we're missing out on a whole section of life and emotion and love, because to grieve is to love, that you can't have one without the other. And when we think about what we shove down people's throats as far as positivity goes, you know, I was positive. I was a positive mother. I was positive about wanting my children to live long, healthy, and happy lives. And yet here I was dealing with the loss of my beloved daughter. So what does that say about me, that I'm not positive enough? I think it's very tempting to use positivity as this antidote to bad things happening, but that is just not the case. And likely, as part of the human condition in this experience together, you all know that. So what happens if we don't force each other or ourselves to pick a lane? What if we can be both? Collective grief is a shared grief experience. You know, the social justice movement is a shared grief experience. COVID, shared grief experience. And I wrote Kobe Bryant down only because I think it's very interesting to dissect the collective grief experience around the loss of a celebrity. When Kobe and his daughter were tragically killed, thousands of people came to the streets to mourn, and they never met him. He's an icon, and they were mourning openly. Yet I question, if it were somebody from their own life, would they be in the street mourning? Would they be as open with their grief and loss as they were to the celebrity who they didn't meet? So what piece of that do we need to make accessible to people so that they can share the grief, even when it's a personal loss, so that they are not grieving alone and behind closed doors, like it's a sickness? So I challenge you to just kind of consider what pieces of a collective grief experience that we've witnessed over the last 6 months especially, do we need to bring into our own lives in order to establish connection with the people closest to us to share in that experience? Because what we see is that it's profoundly different. Self-care, caring for oneself with intention and integrity. It's very easy to sort of toss out self-care. Yeah, my self-care this, but to really be thoughtful and considerate, intentional, and with integrity to develop self-care will only propel us forward in any kind of integration or learning to live with that we might be seeking on our behalf or as we walk alongside somebody else. And to go further with the self-care, we say replenish and deplete, to really consider, does this person, place, thing, activity, hobby, whatever you want to think about, is it replenishing me or is it depleting me? And maybe there's nothing you can do about it, but to understand if you are going to be replenished or depleted is going to help you show up in a new and healthier way. And then especially in this time of COVID, to really consider if there's a difference for you or somebody you love between isolation and disconnection and loneliness. It's kind of like, is there a difference between sadness, grief, and depression? I kind of agree, like I subscribe to isolation and disconnection as resolvable with intention and integrity, whereas loneliness might fall under more of the depression category, where it's just an overall sense of loneliness. So as you start to think about your days in COVID or somebody you love, I find that there is more hope for people when they are able to identify their angst as isolation or disconnection, and then give tools to alleviate that, versus an overwhelming sense of just loneliness, which doesn't feel as hopeful or as resolvable. And then Terri, I guess I would just go back to you here.
Well, I want to comment on some of the things you said. It was really interesting the way you used Kobe Bryant's death as an example of collective communal grieving. And it's such a good question, like, why don't we do that when our mother dies, or, you know, make it a big public thing? And there's an answer to that question. And the answer is that in this culture, we are just desperately lacking a model for communal grieving. And you find it in pretty much any other culture, other than, I'm going to be just really bold and say, you know, your basic Northern European white culture really is kind of shut down in that area. But if you look at South America, Africa, India, China, they have all these wonderful tools for grieving in community that we just don't have. The way we do grief here is you keep a stoic face, you go to a funeral, people come over to your house for a few days and bring you some food, and then you don't hear from them again, and it's over. You go back to work in 3 days. Some of you may have heard me talk in the past about a wonderful teacher named Sabone Fusome. She died a couple years ago, but she was a West African holy woman, shaman, and she traveled around teaching the grief ceremony that her village always did. And some of you may have been to some of her workshops where it's a 3-day communal mourning event. And people are dancing and drumming and screaming and crying and puking and just having it all out there together. And, you know, this is something that many of us in the death awareness movement are trying to bring into modern Western American culture. And I wanted to add one other thing to yours, because I loved everything that you said there, Sarah, about the nonviolent communication and the language. Not only is, you know, trying to one-up somebody on their grief a very ineffective way to help someone, but also reassuring them. And I heard it said once, I love this phrase, reassurance devalues grief. And what, you know, you want your grief to be recognized and you want it to have value because it does have value. It is what makes you who you are. It's part of the puzzle of who you are becoming every year of your life. And, you know, in that puzzle, it's not just all little happy pieces of positivity, as Sarah was describing, but part of those puzzle pieces are pain and loss and trauma and horrible stuff. And it's all of that is necessary for a balanced experience as a human being on earth. It's like a battery has a positive and a negative charge on either end. It won't work without that. So that's just, I'm looking at some of the questions in the chat room, and I can't remember who said this, but talking about recovering and healing, we don't use the word recover in grief anymore, because that suggests that grief is a temporary condition that you patch it up, you go to the hospital, you get an antibiotic, and then you recover like a disease. So grief recovery is not really the current language that we use. And then somebody else was asking about grief groups, support groups, online groups, Facebook groups, where you're in a community of other grievers trying to help each other, and how you can sometimes get bad direction and bad advice in these groups. And someone was asking, how do you know which are the good groups and which are not? And you know by just being in the group. You can tell how it makes you feel. And Sarah and I are both aware, as many of you are, of a group, a national group for bereaved parents. And that's very, very well known. And I have spent most of the last 10 years that I've been doing this work picking up the pieces of parents who've been injured more by being in that group, who call me up and say, all I do is hear people tell their terrible stories over and over and over again. And I see the same people in the group year after year, 25 years, same person coming back to the group, telling the same story. And the group made me feel worse. And I only went to one meeting and I'll never go back. So that's how you recognize groups that are not being led by professionals, because they're just storytelling sessions. And storytelling is important, but you have to give people tools of something to take away with them, an activity to do, a process to do. And we're actually going to do a couple processes here online today. Okay.
And I'd say, Terri, if I could say something,
yes,
you know, the group that might speak to you, there is no right answer. And like Terri said, you really just have to try it on for size. And, you know, our logo motto at Clear Morning is free to grieve. And although I even struggle with my vision of what healthy, good, deep grief model looks like, we all do it differently. And, you know, whether it's this group or that group or whoever's leading it, if you show up and it's meaningful to you, that's what matters. And it's just good to know that you have options and that there are many different ways to walk the path with somebody through their struggle.
And Helen just asked a question of how do we feel about the term grief work. I'm really glad you asked that. The term grief work, you may be surprised to learn, was actually coined by Sigmund Freud in the 1930s. He wrote a paper, you can find it online, it's called Mourning and Melancholia. And he actually came up with that phrase, grief work. And his theory of how to work with grief is to let the person emote and feel and talk about their loss, look at the old pictures, go through all the emotions with the intention of ultimately separating from that relationship. Laura is nodding her head because she's probably a therapist and knows what I'm talking about. And the goal was to, like, eventually you break off and you end the relationship, and that's how you heal. That was Freud. And that was 1930s. That model was the model in therapy, psychotherapy, and psychology for the next 30 years. And it didn't start to change until about the 1960s. And without going off on too much of a tangent here, what happened in the 60s, some of you have heard me say this before, China invaded Tibet. All the monks got chased out of the monasteries and went into exile and ended up in India and other parts in the East, and eventually to Europe and eventually to America. And Buddhism and Eastern thinking came to America in the late 1950s, early 60s, and it seeped into the psychology world. So psychology started to change the way it understood loss and death and grief and the idea of attachment. And what we have now in current grief theory is we don't disconnect from the person. We maintain what is called continuing bonds. And that's very, very different than what Freud said. So that's what I know about grief work. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, if you're going to go to a counselor or a group, you want to work with a leader or a professional who knows this stuff, who's been trained in this stuff. Like Adrienne just said that a doctor helped her understand that not only was she grieving the person she lost, but the person she was before the loss. I mean, it takes a little knowledge and training and experience to be able to point that out to someone, rather than just staying on this level right here, totally focused on, I'm sad, my loss, my loss, my loss, my loss. It's about opening up that space to look at it in different ways. Oh yes, of course, grief takes energy and time. And Sarah, you can read the chats too and just jump in if you want to answer anything. I'm going to move into my little piece on suffering here. So we sent you a handout, a bunch of handouts by email. And one of them was a little document called About Suffering. And you don't have to look at it with me, but I'm going to just give you an overview. We can have a healthy relationship with suffering or an unhealthy relationship with suffering. So here's what unhealthy looks like. We see suffering as a punishment for original sin. You would be amazed at how many people I have counseled who come from a religious background and feel that their loss happened because we're all sinners and we displeased God. Religious issues can really, really muck things up. Similarly, we see suffering as a punishment from God. Or perhaps we see suffering as just random and meaningless, sort of the shit happens approach to suffering. Another aspect of an unhealthy relationship with suffering is that we assume suffering is bad. This is one of the things that we learned from Buddhist thinking coming into our culture, is we learned that suffering has a purpose. It deepens us, it awakens us, it adds those pieces to the puzzle that make us more of a whole person, both sides, positive, negative charge on the battery. But if you think that suffering is absolutely bad and has to be avoided and eliminated as quickly as possible, that is not a healthy relationship with suffering. And because if you're scrambling to avoid it or relieve it, you are not being present with it. And it's like walking down the street and there's a mud puddle and there's no way around the mud puddle, you know, unless you fall into the poison oak bushes on this side or in front of a train track on the other side. You got to walk right through the mud puddle. It's the only way through. The only way out is through, as they used to say. So by contrast, a healthy relationship with suffering looks like this. We shift from wanting to relieve it to wanting to work with it. We see suffering as a gift of grace that awakens us. We understand that reassurance devalues suffering. We see suffering as being filled with meaning and growth. And we seek to be ventilated in our suffering, not insulated from it. So ventilation versus insulation, those are really important words. We should probably add that to your buzzwords, Sarah. So insulated suffering is, and you all know what this feels like. It's like a punch in your solar plexus, that grief, it just closes you up around your heart like this, trying to protect it. And you're just closed up and insulated. You want to cut off the pain and just not even be conscious in any form. A ventilated relationship with suffering looks like this. My heart is open. I'm going to allow this pain to be here because it's here and I don't have a choice. So working with it, going with the flow of it, rather than pushing, resisting, is going to give you a healthy path to restoring balance. And again, we don't say healing or recovering, we say returning to balance or coming into restoration. We restore ourselves. So you guys all have this in the handouts. And for those of you who didn't get it, we're going to send them all to you again when we're finished here. And I think there was something else I was going to say about relationships with suffering. Oh, back to what Sarah was saying about toxic positivity. We talk about this a lot, especially now with New Age philosophy. I don't want to call it theology, but the whole idea of the law of attraction, right? If you think positive thoughts and say the right things and live the right lifestyle and affirm and visualize everything being what you want it to be, you will get those things that you want. And if you don't have the things that you want, if you're poor, if you're sick, if you're alone, if you're suffering, then you obviously were doing something wrong. You weren't thinking positive enough thoughts. You weren't manifesting abundance or whatever that language is. This is very dangerous thinking, and it's really not new at all. It's just your basic Judeo-Christian God punishing you kind of theology wrapped in a different cloak, because it basically says, you know, if you're suffering, you did something wrong to displease the universe, and that's why this bad thing happened to you. So that's a really unhealthy relationship with suffering.